Hey, my name is MB. Have you ever felt completely alone in your own home? 10 years ago, I thought I was safe in my room until I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. The garage door, slowly rising, footsteps following, and I was home, completely alone. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, anything, and crept down the stairs, every step louder than the last. Two shadows, moving through my house, and I realized the nightmare wasn't coming. It was already here. What happened next changed how I would see my home forever. Stay with me, if you dare. There's something about a childhood home that makes you feel invincible. The creaking of the third stair, the particular way the back door sticks in humidity, the smell of the hallway after rain, these things become part of you. You stop seeing the house and start feeling it, the way you feel your own heartbeat. Automatic, unconscious, safe. I grew up in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, not the kind of place people write stories about. Just a normal street with normal houses and neighbors who waved from driveways on Saturday mornings. Our house had 2 floors, a half-finished basement my dad used for woodworking projects that never quite got completed. The kitchen always smelled faintly of whatever my mom had cooked 3 days prior. The carpet on the stairs was a deep burgundy that had faded near the center from years of foot traffic. It was the kind of house that absorbed a family's entire life and held it quietly in its walls. For most of my childhood, I shared a bedroom with my older brother. 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the room, 2 dressers, 2 closets, enough space to coexist, but not enough to truly breathe. We had an unspoken boundary running down the center like a demilitarized zone. His side had sports trophies and a stereo system he was obsessively protective of. My side had books, a lamp, and a stack of homework that never seemed to shrink. It worked. Brothers find a way. Until he left. When he left for college, I remember standing in that bedroom doorway the morning after he'd gone. His bed, stripped of sheets. The ghost of a poster he'd peeled from the wall, leaving a pale rectangle behind. The room felt enormous suddenly, and terrifyingly full of possibility. With his blessing, I pushed his bed into the guest room, dragged in a proper desk from the basement, and spent an entire weekend reorganizing every inch. For the first time in my life, a room was entirely mine. It was mine for 2 years. Then the cycle continued. My brother graduated, came back home, and reclaimed what he considered rightfully his. I was irritated. My parents explained it patiently. You did the same thing to him, my mom said. She was right. I moved into the guest room above the garage. That room was small, barely enough for a full-sized bed, a dresser, and a narrow nightstand. The ceiling sloped on one side where the roofline cut through, and in winter, the cold crept in through the walls like it had nowhere else to go. But it had real privacy. The kind where you could close the door and simply disappear from the rest of the house. 2 windows interrupted the walls, one facing the driveway, one facing the side yard where an overgrown hedge had slowly taken over the flower bed. On summer nights, they let in the crickets. On winter nights, they rattled. And every single time someone pulled into the garage below, the entire floor shuddered for 10 long seconds. He got used to it. It became part of the room's particular rhythm. Until that Friday night in late autumn. My brother was in Baltimore. My parents were at the shore. I remember the particular stillness of that house when it's empty. The refrigerator hums differently. The walls settle in ways they don't when people are moving through the rooms below. I ordered Thai food around 8, ate it sitting cross-legged on my bed. By 10 o'clock, everything was off. At 11:32, I remember the exact time because I had just glanced at my phone. I heard it. The garage door. That low mechanical groan. The metal track engaging. The shudder through the floor beneath my bed. My entire body reacted before my mind caught up. Because no one was supposed to be home. My brother was 4 hours away. My parents never came back early without calling. I lay completely still for 1 full second, staring at the ceiling, telling myself I had imagined it. Then I heard footsteps on the garage floor below. Not my father, not my brother, not anyone I recognized. I sat up slowly. My heart was hammering, deep and hard, like it was trying to warn me. I reached for my phone and then stopped. What if I was wrong? What if my dad had decided to come home early? What if I called 911 and it was nothing? Then I heard voices. 2 of them. Low, male, speaking quietly. Something cold moved through me from the crown of my head down to my feet. I have read the phrase blood running cold 100 times in fiction and never fully understood it until that moment. I swung my legs off the bed, set my feet on the floor without making a sound, and stood. My closet door was already open. The baseball bat was leaning against the inside wall. I had kept it there since college, some half-formed idea about protection that had never felt real until now. I picked it up with both hands and stood in my room, listening. The voices were moving. Through the ceiling below me, I could track them. I dialed 911. My fingers were shaking so badly I misdialed the first time and had to start over. When the operator answered, I pressed the phone against my ear and breathed as slowly as I could. "There are 2 people in my house," I said. "I'm upstairs. I don't know who they are." She told me to stay where I was. "Lock the bedroom door. Stay on the line." I should have listened. I crept down the hallway in complete darkness. I knew exactly where to step to avoid the board that creaked near the bathroom door. I knew how to hug the left wall to skip the one loose spot in the carpet. The house knew me and I knew it, and I used every bit of that knowledge to move without sound. The door was half open. Inside, a small flashlight swept back and forth. I could hear drawers opening, the soft sound of things being shifted and moved. 2 silhouettes, one taller than the other, both broad-shouldered. I stood in the hallway for what felt like an eternity. Then I went in. I swung the bat and connected with something solid. One went down with a sound that was more shock than pain, but the second one moved faster than I thought possible, and then I was on the floor. The bat was gone. His hands were around my throat, and I couldn't breathe, and I couldn't make a sound. I stared sideways at the leg of my mother's dresser, thinking with absolute certainty that I was going to die in this room. I saw the first man rising from the floor. He had something in his hand. The flashlight caught the edge of a blade. And then, sirens. Distant at first, then suddenly everywhere. Red and blue light strobing through the curtains. The man with the knife said something sharp and quiet. The weight lifted off me. Footsteps hammered through the house, toward the back door, the yard, the darkness. I was lying on the floor staring at the ceiling when a police officer knelt beside me and said my name. I was lucky, they said. My parents drove up from the shore that night. My mother held my face in both her hands. My dad was quiet. My brother called from Baltimore. They were both angry with me for leaving the room. "They could have killed you," she said. Not as a dramatic statement, as a fact. She was right. The police found no suspects. What haunted me more than the attack itself was the detail that surfaced later, the garage door. Someone had used the actual code. Someone had watched our house long enough, closely enough, to learn it. A security system went in. New codes, cameras at every entry point. It helped, logically. But logic doesn't reach into the parts of you that stay scared. It settles into the architecture of the house, into the sound of the garage door, into the particular creak of the hallway floor, into the way darkness pools at the bottom of the stairs. I still love that house, but I know now that knowing a place doesn't protect you inside it. And I know that the feeling you have in the last moment before you think it's over, that impossible stillness, is something that stays with you long after everything else fades. Life before and after thinking you're about to die is irrevocably different. It just is. The intruders disappeared, but my mind stayed awake long after the sirens faded. Every creak, every shadow reminded me that the house I grew up in could no longer feel safe. And then, months later, someone tried to trick me. Not with force, but with deception. A phone call, claiming my mother was hurt, lured me out. I rushed, only to return to a house that had been stripped of memories. Everything they took, it wasn't just possessions. It was personal. And someone knew every weakness, every secret of my life. Part 2 will reveal what they wanted and why fear can hide behind the most innocent lies. There are crimes that take things from you, and then there are crimes that study you first. I want to be careful about how I tell this story, because even now, even with months of distance between me and that night, there are parts of it that don't sit right in my chest. Parts that make me go still when my phone rings after 8 o'clock. Parts that make me look twice at people who seem to know just a little too much about my life. About 6 months ago, I moved back to my hometown. I had built a decent life in the city, an apartment I liked, routines I'd grown comfortable with. A job that kept me busy enough not to think too hard about the distance between me and my family. But then my mother's health started slipping in the quiet, gradual way it does with aging parents, and suddenly the distance felt inexcusable. Minor falls, fatigue, a diagnosis that required monitoring. She was proud and independent and deeply resistant to asking for help, but I could read between the lines of our phone calls well enough to understand what wasn't being said. I found a small duplex about 10 minutes from her house. It was the kind of rental that had seen better decades. Thin walls, carpeting that had been replaced once, but not recently, kitchen cabinets that didn't quite close flush. But it was clean, it was affordable, and the location was everything. Close enough to be at her door in under 15 minutes if something happened. The neighborhood was ordinary, a mix of older residents who had been there for 30 years and younger renters cycling through. I knew my immediate neighbors by sight, but not by name. The couple on the other side of the duplex wall were quiet. There was a woman across the street who walked a large retriever every morning at 7. Unremarkable, safe-seeming. My mother's house was 10 minutes away in a neighborhood she'd lived in for over 2 decades. She knew the pharmacist by name. She went to the same church since before I was born. Her medical history was known to her doctor's office, to the small pharmacy on the corner of her block, and to me, or so I believed. I had been pushing her for months to get a medical alert system, one of those pendant devices that lets you call for help with a single button press. She resisted. "I'm fine," she'd say, and mostly she was. But the falls worried me. Small ones, she said, just losing my balance for a second. Nothing serious. But a fall at her age, alone in the house at night, could become serious very quickly and very quietly, and that thought sat in the back of my mind constantly. On this particular evening, a Tuesday in the early part of the year, I was home alone. I had visited my mother that afternoon. We had tea, watched a program. I'd left around 6 once she'd had dinner and seemed settled. I drove back to the duplex, changed into comfortable clothes, and spent the evening doing very little. The television was on, something I wasn't fully watching. Takeout containers on the coffee table, a lamp in the corner throwing soft yellow light across the room. By 9 o'clock, the neighborhood outside had gone quiet. A car passed occasionally. The couple next door were either out or already in bed. I was half watching, half thinking about calling my mother before she went to sleep, when my phone lit up on the cushion beside me. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I get enough spam calls that my reflex is to let anything unrecognized go to voicemail. But something made me pick it up. I don't know what. I've thought about that decision many times since. The woman on the other end had a calm, professional voice. Measured, neutral, and practiced, designed to deliver difficult information without crumbling. She identified herself as a nurse at the hospital. She said my mother's full name. She said she'd been brought in following a fall at home. It was important that I come as soon as possible. I was on my feet before she finished the sentence. Everything, my half-eaten dinner, the television, the quiet evening, disappeared. There was only the call. She referenced a recent visit to her cardiologist, a detail so specific and so accurate that it didn't occur to me for even 1 second to question whether this was real. Why would it? "Is she okay?" I asked. "Can you tell me what happened?" The woman said she was stable, but that they needed family present. I was already moving. Keys off the hook by the door. Jacket grabbed from the chair. I didn't lock the back window I'd left cracked open. I didn't double-check the door behind me. I simply ran. The drive to the hospital was 8 minutes. I remember almost nothing about it. My mind was entirely on my mother, constructing scenarios, bargaining with the universe. I pulled into the emergency parking lot still half-dressed, shoes untied, and walked through the sliding glass doors into the bright sterile light. I gave the receptionist my mother's name. She typed, looked at the screen, typed again, then looked up at me with that expression, someone trying to be careful. "I don't have any record of that patient being admitted tonight," she said. I stared at her. I asked her to check again. She did. Nothing. I gave her every identifying detail I could produce. No record. No admission. No fall. Nothing. I called my mother with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. She answered on the third ring, groggy and confused. She had been asleep. She was at home. She was fine. "What's wrong?" she kept asking. "What happened?" And I had to stand in a hospital waiting room and tell her someone had called me pretending she was hurt. I told her she needed to check that her doors were locked. I didn't fully understand why yet. The realization arrived the way the worst realizations do. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one landing with its own particular weight. I had been tricked into leaving. Someone had wanted me out of my house. Someone who knew my mother's full name, her address, her medical history, the name of her cardiologist. Someone who had constructed a story precise enough that I hadn't hesitated. I drove home in a state I can only describe as controlled disintegration. Fury and fear running parallel, neither one winning. I turned onto my street and knew before I reached the driveway. The front door was not the way I had left it. I stopped the car. I sat for a moment looking at the door, at the darkened windows of the duplex. Everything looked completely normal. That was the worst part. I called 911 from the car before I went inside. When the officers arrived and we went in together, I understood the full shape of what had been done to me. The place had been gone through methodically, not frantically. Drawers closed after being searched. Closet doors shut. This was someone who had taken their time. Someone who had known they had their time. The electronics were gone. Laptop, tablet, a camera I'd had for years. Those I could absorb. But then I started noticing the other things. The framed photographs from my dresser. Specific ones. Nothing a stranger would value. A small jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother. Prescription bottles from my bathroom cabinet with my name and address on the labels. Things that had no resale value. Things that were only meaningful because they were mine and because taking them meant someone had stood in my most private spaces and made deliberate choices about what would hurt most to lose. That part one have never been able to fully process. The police took a report. They noted the method, the phone call, the impersonation, the targeted personal information, and told me it was a sophisticated social engineering scheme. Premeditated. They asked how someone might have obtained the details. Her name and address were easy, public records. But the cardiologist's name, the recent visit, that required access. Someone listening. Someone at a pharmacy counter. Someone we had talked near. I had the locks changed. I finally got my mother the medical alert pendant. I installed cameras. I did everything the rational checklist says to do. But security systems don't fix the violation of knowing someone studied you. Building a profile of your vulnerabilities and your love and your fear, and using it all against you in a call that lasted less than 2 minutes. The case remains open. No suspects were ever identified. I don't know who did this, which means I don't know if they're still watching. And not knowing is its own particular kind of haunting. I still flinch at unknown numbers after dark. I still do a slow scan of my street before I get out of my car at night. I still catch myself in public, wondering who might be nearby and listening, cataloging, adding details to some inventory of my life. This was not a burglary. A burglary is an opportunist with a crowbar. This was something else. This was someone thinking carefully about the most efficient way to dismantle my sense of safety. They used my love for my mother as the mechanism. They used my fear as the key. And the thing about that is that it worked perfectly the first time. The feeling of being watched never went away, no matter how many cameras I installed. It wasn't just theft, it was calculated, cruel, and someone had planned every detail. And then the real horror appeared. A stranger came to my door, claiming he lived there. He knew every corner, every secret of the house. He showed me photos, documents, things only an insider could have, and he didn't care that I called the police. Part 3 will uncover what happened next, and why the person was always one step ahead, watching, waiting. I want to start by saying that I am not someone who scares easily. I'm a practical person. Early 30s, live alone, been taking care of myself for long enough that I don't jump at shadows or read danger into every unfamiliar sound. I grew up in houses where things creaked and settled at night, and I learned early that most unsettling sounds have boring explanations. Wind, pipes, a neighbor's television bleeding through shared walls. I have never been the kind of person who lies awake cataloging noises. I tell you this because I want you to understand exactly how far outside my nature it was to feel the way I felt on that Thursday night, and on the night weeks later when I came home and understood fully and finally what had been happening around me. I had been renting the house for just over a year when it started. It was a standalone rental in a quiet residential neighborhood, the kind of street where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and generally pay very little attention to one another. The house itself was modest: 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a living room that opened into a small dining area, and a kitchen that faced the backyard through a window above the sink. The previous tenant had lived there for 3 years without incident, nothing remarkable. I had made the place mine over the course of that year in the small, accumulated ways that turn a rental into a home. A rug I'd had since my first apartment, bookshelves I'd assembled myself along the living room wall, photographs on the hallway wall. I knew every inch of that house. The master bedroom door that stuck slightly in its frame if the humidity was high. The back door that required a firm pull before the lock would engage properly. The particular way the kitchen floorboards announced your presence. My domestic geography, things you only know after living inside it. Thursday, around 11 at night. I was in the living room. The television was on, but I wasn't really watching it. I had my laptop open, finishing something for work, the kind of low-stakes, late-night task that keeps your hands busy. The neighborhood outside was completely silent. No cars, no voices. That deep, residential quiet that settles in after 10 o'clock when everyone has retreated indoors. That's when it started. Then the pounding started. Not knocking. Knocking is a social gesture. What I heard was impact, fist against wood, hard and rhythmic and aggressive, the kind of sound that doesn't ask to be let in so much as demand it. It shook the front door in its frame. I stood up slowly, every instinct suddenly alert. My laptop slid off my knee. I didn't move toward the door. Instead, I moved to the window beside it and looked out through the gap in the curtain. There was a man on my front step. He was somewhere in his 40s, I estimated, disheveled in the particular way of someone who had either been traveling or sleeping rough, or both. He was wearing a jacket that looked too thin, carrying a bag, and he was pounding on my door while looking behind him. I did not open the door. "Who is it?" I called through the wood. I am not proud of how my voice sounded. "Open the door," he said. Not a request, a statement. The tone of someone who believes they are owed entry. This is my house. I stood very still on my side of the door, processing, recalibrating, trying to locate the rational explanation that had to exist for a disheveled stranger to be at my door at 11 o'clock claiming residency. "This is my rental," I said. "I think you have the wrong address." What happened next is the part that started to dismantle my composure. He described the master bedroom door, the way it sticks, the back door, the firm pull required before the lock catches. He said these things through my front door in the dark like he'd carried them for years. Automatically, possessively. I opened the door on the chain. He produced papers, folded, worn, a lease agreement with this address, mail addressed to a name I didn't recognize, and photographs, printed photographs, slightly faded, showing the interior of my house, the living room, the hallway, the kitchen. I stood at my chained door, holding these photographs, and I experienced a fracture in my sense of reality, not because I believed him, but because I couldn't immediately and completely disprove him. The details he knew, the photographs he had. There was a terrible awful window where I could not locate solid ground. Had someone lived here before me without the landlord's knowledge? Had the tenancy overlapped in some way? Had someone been given a key they were never asked to return? Then I noticed his eyes. There was something in them that wasn't quite right, not menacing exactly. Something else, the particular quality of a person who is entirely certain of something that isn't true. The unshakable conviction of a man who had built an entire reality around this address. It was more frightening than anger. "I'm going to call the police," I said. The change was immediate and complete. The urgency drained out of him. His shoulders dropped. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't read, more complicated and more sad. And then he walked into the dark without another word. I stood at the chain door watching the street until I couldn't see him anymore. Then I locked both locks, went to the back door and checked it, checked every ground floor window, and called the police from the kitchen with my back against the wall. The two officers who arrived were professionally calm. I showed them the photographs he had left behind. He had dropped them on the step. I described what he had said, the details he had known. One of the officers nodded in recognition. They suggested it was likely a mental health episode, a delusion. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of the master bedroom, the stuck frame door bedroom, and turned the evening over and over. A mental episode explained his behavior. It didn't fully explain the photographs, or how he knew the physical quirks of a house he, theoretically, had no access to. Weeks passed. The incident began to recede in the way disturbing things do when nothing follows them. Not forgotten, but filed away. I changed nothing, did not call the landlord, did not change the locks. In retrospect, this is the decision I return to most often. It was a weeknight, just after 9, when I came home and found the front door unlocked. I stood on the front step for a full moment, just looking at it. The door was closed, but not latched, a narrow gap between door and frame. I pushed it open slowly. The living room had been taken apart, not violently. That is what was most disturbing. Not the chaos of rage or panic, but the systematic, almost clinical dismantling of a space. Sofa cushions removed, books pulled from shelves and stacked on the floor, photographs lifted from the wall and laid face up. Every room on the ground floor had been gone through in the same deliberate, unhurried manner. Drawers opened and left open, cabinet doors standing wide. The electronics were untouched. My laptop open on the coffee table, the television. Nothing of obvious monetary value had been taken. But things were missing, small, personal things. A spare set of keys from the kitchen drawer, an old address book I kept in the desk, personal mail opened and restacked, a photograph from the hallway, one specific photograph, leaving a gap like a missing tooth. He had used a key. There was no forced entry, no broken window, no damaged lock. He had walked into my house with a key that opened my front door, a key that should not have existed. My landlord had given me 2 copies. Both were on my keychain. The locks had never been changed from the previous tenancy. That detail arrived with full weight. The police this time were more thorough, more attentive to the connection. They noted the lack of forced entry. They took the missing key as a likely explanation. They contacted my landlord, who was audibly shaken. No overlap in leases, no unaccounted copies, nothing in the paperwork. I had the locks changed that night. A locksmith came at 11:30 while I sat on the kitchen counter watching and trying to look less frightened than I was. I called my landlord again the next morning and demanded a full accounting. The list was short and unhelpful. Here is what I know for certain. A man appeared at my door with intimate knowledge of my home's physical details, photographs taken inside my living space, and documentation linking him to my address. Weeks later, my home was entered without force, searched methodically, and specific personal items were removed. These 2 events are connected. The most unsettling possibility, the one I've never been able to set down completely, is the photographs. Specifically, the question of when they were taken. They showed a living room that looked like my living room, my furniture, my rug, my bookshelves along the wall. Not the living room of a previous tenant. Mine. Which means either he had been inside my home during the year I lived there, moving through my space while I was absent, taking photographs of a life he had decided was also his, or he had been inside it before that Thursday night, and the ransacking 3 weeks later was not the first time. I stayed in the house for 2 more months, because moving felt like surrender. I installed cameras at both exterior doors. I checked the locks every night before bed, in a ritual that became as automatic as brushing my teeth. I stopped leaving windows cracked. I became a more frightened person. Eventually, I moved. Not dramatically, My lease was coming up anyway, but I know why I didn't renew it. I know what I was leaving behind. The case was never resolved. The man was never positively identified. The photographs were kept by the police. I never saw them again. What stays with me, what I suspect will always stay with me, is not the pounding or the ransacked rooms, or even the knowledge that someone had a key. What stays with me is the look in his eyes at the door that Thursday night, the absolute, unshakable certainty that he belonged there. He believed that house was his, and somewhere in the gap between what he believed and what was true, he had found his way inside, and I still don't know how many times. Weeks passed, and then I came home to find my sanctuary destroyed. Rooms trashed, personal items untouched, and yet someone had entered without permission. They had a key, and they believed this was their home. Documentation, photos, a copy of my key, and no one knew who they were. Even now, every shadow, every faint noise makes me question, am I really alone? This is the reality of true fear. Burglars who strike when you least expect, deception that fools your mind, strangers who know too much. Your home may seem safe, but in truth, true horror waits behind doors you think are locked, and sometimes it's watching you right now. Remember, fear isn't just in what happens to you. It's in knowing someone could already be inside waiting.